Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're taking a break from landscape painting and tackling this beautiful magnolia flower. When I paint a floral scene like this, I use a slightly different technique than what I use when painting my landscapes. But I'll cover those differences as we work through the painting. So grab your brushes and let's get started. When I'm working on a subject like this, I work out my key dimensions, the bottom of the flower, the top of the flower and the width of the flower before I get into any real detail. I'm going to tackle this subject a little bit differently to my landscapes. In a landscape, I normally wet the back of the paper and I don't bother taping it down to the board. In this case, because I'll be working on different petals while waiting for one petal to dry, I'll work on another petal. There's no big advantage with wetting the back of the paper. I'll also need to use the hairdryer quite regularly, which makes it more difficult to keep the back of the paper wet anyway. I'm also going to mask the flower. By doing that, I'll be able to paint the background very quickly. This is the masking fluid I use. It's made by Winsor and Newton. There are other brands that you can use that are probably just as good. This just happens to be the one I use. First thing I do when I'm masking a subject is get a container, put in a couple of drops of dishwashing liquid and add about ½ an inch or a centimetre of water in the bottom. For those of you who haven't used masking fluid before, the main thing is don't use a good brush. So these are some old brushes that I reserve for my use of masking, because while the masking fluid is removable, and you should always make sure it is removable because there is some masking that you can buy that's not removable, but for our purposes we definitely want the removable masking. So while it's removable from the paper, if it gets into all the hairs of your brush, you just won't get it out. Okay, so that's the key thing, and the technique I use with the soapy water helps reduce the risk of the masking drying on your brush. The other thing is to make sure your paper is bone dry when you do this. You can't use masking on paper that's damp, and it needs to be paper that's got plenty of sizing on it. So this is Archer's cold press paper. It works very well with masking. I've never had any trouble with it. So the first thing I do is dip my brush in the soapy water, drag 90% of the water out of it, and then go into the masking. Just like that. See how I'm holding the brush, gives me a lot of control. And I dip it in masking twice before going back into the soapy water and cleaning the brush. I have this pointy brush that I use for fine detail. I allowed myself to get distracted and went outside of the line. I'll fix that before I start painting. Now I clean the brush and repeat the process. Now we have to let that dry thoroughly before we can paint the background. The top layer of the masking is dry, so I could paint over it without the masking moving or being dissolved in any way, which means I can work on the background. There's still some cockling in the paper because of the moisture underneath the masking. For a simple background like this, that isn't going to cause me any trouble. So let's mix some colours and then we'll do this background. I'm going to go with a dark violet and dull green background, and it's going to be all wet on wet. So for the dark violet, we'll start with some French ultramarine. Some permanent rose. And I'll dull that with a small amount of cad orange. So for the brighter areas, we'll start with some aureolin or any cool leaning yellow. Cool leaning yellow has a little bit of blue in it, so it leans a little bit to the green. And I'll dull it with a small amount of raw umber. So I'm going to start with a light colour. You can see how I can paint really quickly because I don't have to worry about the edges. The light's going to come through here. A little bit down here. I'm going to give that a light spray to keep it workable. Remember, the back of my paper is not wet, so this is going to dry reasonably fast. Cover this as quickly as possible, then I'll come back and make adjustments. Just break up these flat areas. Where you have V shapes like this, you'll find a lot of extra moisture will pool at that edge, so you have to reduce that amount of pooling. Otherwise you'll end up with cauliflowers happening at that point. Because these petals are going to be quite light, the light is directly shining on them. I wanted a dark background to help contrast with that. Same here, so I'm going to drop in some dark paint. To speed things up, I'm going to go and dry this with a hairdryer. So I've thoroughly dried the paper. I even lifted the tape so I could dry the back because there was moisture underneath the masking, and if I didn't get rid of all of that, when I lift the masking you risk tearing some of the paper. The best way to lift the masking off your paper is with one of these. It's called a Crepe eraser. This one was a square block when I got it. I just cut it in half and donated the other half to one of my students at the time. They last for years. And you just very lightly rub the masking with that. You can see how it's just lifting that masking. A lot easier than using your thumb or finger. The other thing to do at this stage is look at your flower and see if there's any edges that aren't quite right. For instance, this. So all I'm doing is getting a damp brush, wetting that area, and then just lifting it. Another technique is to get a stiff bristle brush like this. This is synthetic bristle. And then very little water on your brush. Just think in terms of you just wetting the paint on the paper but not the paper itself. And the same here, this edge was messed up a bit. Right, the background is finished. We can now start working on the flower itself. My aim is to create a flower that has plenty of depth in it. Let's make some room on my palette. I don't need this colour anymore. Primarily it's a pink flower, and the pink I have in my palette is Permanent Rose. So we'll start with a weak mix. Even that's a bit strong for some areas, so I'll put some in here. Great, so that's our lightest mix there. And cobalt blue is the main blue I'll be using. Again, it's very light. French ultramarine, Permanent Rose, and a little bit of cobalt blue, and I'll use this for some of the shadows on the flower. So I'm going to start with some very weak cad orange. Barely tinting the paper. Then I'll pick up some of this pink. So whenever I say pink, I'm referring to Permanent Rose. Just a hint of brighter pink there coming through. All right, so with a technique like this, you're working on one petal at a time. If I look at this petal here, it's touching this petal, so I can't work on this petal at the moment because as soon as I wet this, the two will want to merge. So while this is drying, I'll work on either this petal or that one. We'll just work on this one next. Just some very, very weak cat orange. I'll go into the weak pink. This petal has two shadows, but they're on the inside, so we're just seeing hints of them through the translucent petal material. One's a warmer colour up here and the other one is cooler. But I will drop some warmer pink down here and along this edge. Let's work on this petal here. So this is the underpainting stage. We're now going to start putting in more detail. So I just put in this darker shadow colour and then I soften that edge with a damp brush. This is what we call a glaze, so with watercolour wash over another wash. With a glaze, the underpainting has to be quite dry, however. This area is a bit too dry, so I'm just going to very quickly run over it with a damp brush, and that'll let these colours blend together. I'm going to adjust this, so rather than have it quite pale, I'm going to make it quite red, because I think it'll balance better with these other stronger petals. This is a little bit of artistic license. I have a saying that says, never let reality get in the way of a good painting. Alright, we'll let that dry. Let's work on this petal here now. Now I've got very little paint in my brush. You can see how the brush is not bouncing back to a point, but it's quite strong paint. There's a lot of subtle shapes and shadows in this underneath the curved part of the petal that makes that petal curve over. Now there's a shadow in there. I can't do anything with that until this area dries. Alright, I'm going to do this petal now. I'm going to go and dry that. Let's work on this petal now. Okay, let me dry this. I'm just dulling the permanent rose with some cobalt blue. Lift out some lighter areas. Okay, let me dry that. So what I did there is just put a little bit of paint on that edge and then soften it on the other side to make it curl a little bit. All right, now I've got to dry that so I can paint this section here. I have to paint this very quickly because the paper is still a little bit warm. Let's dry that. All right, let me dry this because I can't paint it because I've got wet paint around it. Right, while that's cooling down, I'm going to mix some colours for this. Let's clean a mixing area. All right. Right, so the bright green that we see is just some cobalt turquoise and aureolin. And some French ultramarine and burnt sienna for the darker area, mixed with some of the green. Some burnt sienna and raw umber for the stem. Just clean the brush and then just soften some of these edges. Now I'll go back and finish this. Clean the brush, just some of these edges. This is a bit too bright, so I'm going to go over it with some cobalt blue, just a weak mix. Another technique, if you want to drop in some soft edges, is you pre-wet the area like this. And then you can just touch the brush to that wet spot. I wanted to make that part of the petal curl a little bit more, so I've darkened underneath, effectively just created a darker shadow there. I think this area here has got too much light on it. So I'm going to get mainly cobalt blue. It'll mix with a little bit of the pink that's already on this. It's better. So I'll do a quick glaze with that. That's good. I just wanted to push that back in the picture plane a little bit. Now I'm just looking to see if there's any small adjustments I need to make. I think this shadow area here is too light relative to the other shadow areas. It's a bit too strong. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.